We've already covered a wonderful array of horror movies in our 80s Horror Memory series, and among them, there's a subgenre synonymous with the era, the slasher. Our first episode for 1981 took a retrospective look back on the year that helped to establish the much-loved subgenre, with classic titles such as Halloween 2, Friday the 13th Part 2, and My Bloody Valentine, just to name a few. Thankfully for this particular horror fan, I had a sibling with a handy ability to get his hands on VHS copies of such totally inappropriate but totally awesome movies that we would watch when our folks ventured out for the evening. John Carpenter's Halloween blew my now horror-riddled mind and the basic premise of the slasher movie, i.e. gather a group of attractive young people, add a homicidal maniac to the mix, then watch the killing spree play out in gruesome and inventive ways. It was pretty much my new favorite way to spend a Friday night. However, it wasn't just horror movies that became a covert and highly enjoyable pastime in my household. The 80s also diverted our attention to a certain Austrian oak, whose movies not only brought action classics into our lives,
let off some steam, Bennett,
but also journeys to fantasy epics and sci-fi horror even. If there was one star that helped to define the 80s for us as movie fans, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And there's one of his genre-defining movies in particular that you could argue is a slasher, the James Cameron classic, The Terminator. So join us as we go back in time, fully clothed, ideally, and hunt down the key to humanity's future salvation in the horror slasher, or well, is it, The Terminator.
I'll be back.
Now, before I put forward my argument for just exactly why The Terminator could be considered a badass slasher movie, let's take a brief detour into the classic tropes of the genre to establish the similarities and to look at how their simplicity has helped the subgenre endure for so long. What's so appealing about the subgenre are the endless variations on the stalk and slash formula that are possible, but the gore-splattered heart of them remains the same. Just consider John Carpenter's original Halloween movie and how its longevity still entices movie fans to cinemas to this day, albeit to slightly diminishing returns, in terms of quality at least. Halloween was the blueprint for how to make a slasher movie. It's a film that took cues from older horror movies such as Psycho and Black Christmas, as well as other more niche titles such as Mario Bava's A Bay of Blood. Halloween showed budding horror filmmakers that if they had a good premise, a young, cheap, but talented cast, plus a gimmick that could be franchisable, then you had yourself a slasher movie. Many films followed that simple blueprint, and when The Terminator hit cinemas in 1984, it was at the height of the slasher frenzy.
Of course, I'm biased, but I think The Terminator stands as another perfect example of genre filmmaking. Everything about it. The cinematography, the storytelling, the effects, the performances. Jim Cameron is a master, and that is one of his greatest masterpieces.
What we all love so much about this crazy industry we find ourselves often immersed in is that film and people's opinion of it is largely subjective. So if you have a conversation with your pals, family members, or colleagues and mention that The Terminator is a slasher movie, the response you may get is,
"Get the f*** out of here! No, I cannot, it's serious!"
Which I guess is a fair assumption to make. On the surface, it's an action and science fiction movie. However, if you consider the evidence to the contrary, then the movie is essentially a slasher flick. The first and most obvious argument for this is in Arnie's seemingly unstoppable villain, the T-800. And then there's Linda Hamilton's protagonist, Sarah Connor, who is essentially the stereotypical final girl. When we first meet her, she's working a dead-end job as a waitress. She isn't exactly killing it on the dating scene, and is then pursued by a killing machine from the future, because her destiny is to give birth to the leader of the human resistance.
His name is Connor. John Connor. Your son, sir.
She goes from timid waitress to Terminator-crushing heroine across the trajectory of her story arc, and follows in the similarly badass footsteps of characters such as Ellen Ripley and Laurie Strode. On the other hand, however, is Arnie's T-800, a terrifying and unstoppable killing machine that obliterates everyone in its path, including a police station full of poor, unsuspecting cops. Throughout the narrative, he makes his way to Sarah Connor by effortlessly picking off his targets one by one. Much like horror icons Michael Myers, Leatherface, or Jason Voorhees before him, one of the most recognizable arcs for the protagonist in slasher movies is the gradual, horrific realization that somebody is coming to kill them in a gratuitously bloody way.
You're dead, honey.
In the Terminator, most of the personal information and records about people are destroyed in the future. You know, the same future that Kyle Reese is sent back from to protect Sarah Connor. So therefore, all the T-800 has to go on is Sarah Connor's name and the knowledge that she will become the mother of the resistance leader that fights the machines. The T-800 looks up all known Sarah Connors in the area and systematically slaughters them, leaving an impressive and bloody trail of corpses in just the opening third of the movie.
I saw the Terminator opening weekend 3 times in Framingham, Massachusetts. And one of the things I loved about the Terminator is that it was just so relentless. The thing about the Terminator is that it is so propulsive in its storytelling. If you imagine Michael Biehn, he's got her in the car, and you get an entire 2-minute scene of exposition. It's just pure backstory, talked while there's a car chase and guns blazing. It's the most perfect vehicle for exposition ever because you're in a vehicle hearing the exposition and you're moving the story forward. So I think in a lot of ways the metronomic precision of the screenplay was the thing that really resonated with me, and it made me find a copy of the script to read it because I wanted to see what I saw on screen, how was it represented on page. And that kind of started my sort of initial interest in not just screenwriting, but just how things are written to be turned into movies. And I have a very large and disturbing collection of screenplays that sit in storage.
As well as the seemingly unstoppable force of nature that is Arnie's T-800, the movie also displays other classic tropes of the genre, such as the classic sex equals death trope seen in countless other slashers. Carpenter's Halloween is a good example, as is Friday the 13th, just to name 2 films. And the consensus is that if you have sex in a slasher movie, you're gonna go out with a bang, if you pardon the pun. Now, the reason behind this particular trope has been discussed for decades. Are these sexually active teens being punished for having sex? Or is it more that they're simply distracted by intercourse to see the lumbering psychopath that's about to gut them like a fish? Whatever the motive for the killer and filmmakers is during these scenes, which, to be honest, may have been an easy way to entice teens into multiplexes with the promise of some sex and nudity, the Terminator features a scene during the T-800's hunt for Sarah Connor, right out of the slasher playbook. After her date calls to ditch her, she leaves her roommate Ginger to spend some quality time with her boyfriend, and heads out to the movies alone. In classic slasher tradition, she hears a news report about the dead Sarah Connors, and understandably begins to freak out. After doing some very 80s research by sifting through a phone book, remember those? She realizes that she's next in order on the T-800's shit list, ditches her slice of double pepperoni, and gets the hell out of there. Upon leaving, she notices a creepy guy following her, who we know is just good old Kyle Reese there to save the poor lady, and heads into the nightclub Tech Noir to escape. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, a post-coitus Ginger and her fella are brutally murdered by a hulking Arnie in full-on Michael Myers mode, throwing Ginger's unlucky boyfriend around the room before fatally throwing him through the door and shooting Ginger in the back a couple of times. It's a shame that Ginger and her boyfriend didn't realize that they were in a badass slasher movie. Otherwise, they would have been running, not getting busy. But that's the trope, folks, so just go with it. The scene displays all the classic hallmarks of a slasher movie, from the sex to the T-800's hulking and menacing presence, to Ginger not hearing her fella being murdered as she's gone off to the kitchen for a snack with her headphones on, all the way to the killer finding out about Sarah's whereabouts from her desperate plea for help on the answering machine. This leads the T-800 straight to Tech Noir, where we get a full-on action scene that still has shades of a classic slasher about it, before Kyle comes out with the now iconic,
"Come with me if you want to live."
The Terminator. That was such a great cinematic piece of history. And well, first of all, Schwarzenegger being just the huge icon that he is, and that even furthered his icon status for sure. And if anyone should be walking around naked on film, it's him. And I think when we also had some time travel involved in Terminator. So I'm a big fan of time travel. In fact, one of my favorite 80's movies is Somewhere in Time. Super not in the horror genre, mind you. It's more of a romantic date night film, but it does involve time travel. So that always intrigues me. What can we, if we travel in time, can we affect what happens in the past or the future, or vice versa? That question is like a big mind blower for me. So here he is coming from the future to stop something from the past so that the future will change. And that alone was enough to get me excited. And then he's a machine that gets more revealed as the movie progresses. So again, AI, robotics, the future. What does it hold? I think we're all intrigued by that. And will machines become sentient? Age-old question. And as we sit here in this year, in this time and era, it's looking more and more possible, which scares the crap out of me.
You could argue that the basic, but most essential requirements for a slasher film are the killer, the body count, the methods of murder, the focus of the movie, and in some cases, the setting. The tropes we mentioned earlier in the video are also essential to the overall enjoyment of the movie, and alongside the sex and death and the final girl trope, any slasher movie worthy of the name should also highlight some useless cops and unhelpful grown-ups, a cool mask, or at least an unmasking of sorts, cruel and unusual deaths, the seemingly dead killer's resurrection, and the reveal of the antagonist. However, does the Terminator deliver on all of these slasher tropes? Well, let's take a closer look at the evidence. The killer is fairly obvious, as we all know some merciless T-800 action, and the body count is incredibly high, with a large number of cops killed in the police station raid. The method of murder is a little murkier, however, and while it's not quite as inventive as more traditional slasher films, we still get some great kills. Arnie's T-800 gleefully shoots a whole number of unfortunate cops and other Sarah Connors. And we also get a heart ripped out, a cop's head being fatally bashed against his car, and of course, Sergeant Wright being run down by a car. The cops here at least try to be helpful to poor stalked Sarah Connor, but they are ultimately pretty useless, as is the rest of the more adult cast, Kyle Reese aside. Now, when it comes to the cool mask, the Terminator doesn't necessarily fit the bill here exactly. However, there is indeed an unmasking of sorts, as the T-800, fresh from being engulfed in a fiery semi-truck explosion, stumbles out of the wreckage and collapses, but not before the Terminator's endoskeleton rises from the flames and gives chase.
And Jim approached my father, Stan Winston, with this brilliant concept art and a brilliant script, and Stan knew that he had found a fellow innovator in Jim and signed on to do the Terminator effects. When the film was originally presented to Stan, Jim did not consider building a full-size endoskeleton. Once all the skin is ripped off and you see the full endoskeleton, all those sequences were going to be achieved through stop-motion animation. But Stan convinced Jim that he could get a lot of his shots with a full-sized robot. And so Stan and his team did that. They built full-size robot, half bodies, insert heads, as well as all the makeup effects that was to go on Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that all came together to create one of the most iconic sci-fi horror characters in movie history, the Terminator.
It's an extremely cool and endlessly iconic moment that fits nicely into the seemingly dead killer's resurrection trope. We also get the obligatory, and of course premature, celebratory embrace between Sarah and Kyle. At the same time, final girl Sarah completes her cool character arc by crushing the T-800 in a hydraulic press. The ending is pure sci-fi horror and ties in nicely with the slasher genre by showing the T-800 stopping at nothing to kill its target. Its hand is almost around her throat just before she can finally defeat it.
You're terminated, fucker!
Like other characters from classic slasher films, the T-800 is impossible to stop. Throughout the movie, it strides from location to location, shrugging off bullets and knife wounds with minimal damage. And when it does get its head banged up, it simply sets about repairing itself.
The Terminator, having been involved in the Terminator franchise a little bit, Terminator Genesis with Arnold, but the original Terminator is, the whole model of it is a slasher film. The Terminator, how he behaves, what he does, it just has a great storyline and a love story at its core, which is why I like it more than T2, because I think that's it. The Michael Biehn love story is what grounds that entire, and Linda Hamilton love story is what grounds the entire franchise. It's a great slasher monster movie that with this killer robot coming after you, which could be Michael Myers, could be Jason, could be any one of them. It is exactly that. It's just so well done, and the story has such rich textures because Cameron is, James Cameron is a pretty amazing filmmaker. That I would, hands down say the original Terminator is a horror movie, and I think part of the problem with its subsequent sequels, and not T2, but why so many of them have not worked, is because each one of them gets more and more expensive and refuses to acknowledge those roots.
It shouldn't come as a surprise that the Terminator bears more than just a passing resemblance to some of the more popular slasher horror flicks at the time. Director James Cameron, who began his career in horror with Piranha 2: The Spawning, went on record to express his admiration for what John Carpenter did with Halloween in 1978, and his effective way of filming on a shoestring budget that he would look to replicate on the Terminator, saying that, "My contemporaries were all doing slasher horror movies. John Carpenter was the guy I idolized the most. He made Halloween for $30,000 or something. That was everyone's break-in dream, to do a stylish horror movie. It was a very slasher film type image, and it really was the launching pad for the story." Cameron has also said that he shot the Terminator as a Tech Noir movie, the name for a genre he coined himself, and also the name of the nightclub in the film, dismissing it as a mere horror film or even a slasher. In our opinion though, Mr. Cameron, we think it most definitely bears all the necessary hallmarks of a slasher movie. And as kids, that was one of the first things that we noticed while watching the film. I hadn't had that much awareness of too many slashers by the time the Terminator was released on VHS. However, I'd seen enough of the genre to recognize that the great hulking brute that Arnie played in the T-800 was reminiscent of the masked horror icons that were popular at the time. We even watched the movie at a friend's parents' house as part of their birthday party, only for said boring parents to fast forward through the sex scenes and anything construed to be too kinky. Yeah, that's right, they were fine with the kids watching people getting brutally murdered, but the nudity, even partial on screen, oh no. Talk about some killjoys. So what's your take on the Terminator and the evidence that we presented here to support it as more than just Tech Noir, but also a badass slasher flick? It's undeniably one of the coolest, most iconic films ever put to celluloid. But in my humble opinion, it also kicks ass as a slasher. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.
On the next episode, let's head down to the small town of Kingston Falls. But if you find an adorable mogwai there, remember these 3 rules. Keep them out of the light, keep them out of the water, and never, ever feed them after midnight. Until next time, gorehounds.
Hi friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.